May 29th, 1453. The great walls of Constantinople, guardians of an empire for over 1,000 years, were breached. The last Byzantine emperor fell. The city's bells stopped ringing. Across Europe and Asia, a new chapter in world history opened under a single name, Mehmed, the Conqueror. But inside the palace, behind folded curtains and guarded doors, a different story unfolded. One that would be spoken of only in whispers, altered in official annals, buried in fragmentary notes and merchant letters, and nearly erased by the very machinery that produced the victory. It is the story of Princess Theodora, who she was, why she mattered, and the unsettling question posed by the records we do have. What did Sultan Mehmed II do to her after the fall of Constantinople? If this episode speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe and hit like. We're about to reconstruct a small human drama inside one of history's largest political earthquakes. We begin where the public story begins, the siege itself. For 53 days in the spring of 1453, the Ottoman army encircled Constantinople. The Ottomans brought new technology to siege warfare, massive cannons that could batter even the thickest walls, and the defenders improvised with courage and dwindling supplies. Emperor Constantine V's Palaiologos led the defense. His death on the final day entered legend. Contemporary Ottoman chronicles frame the conquest as a divinely sanctioned triumph. Refugee Byzantine accounts record a city in flames and a people unmoored. Venetian and Genoese letters from merchants who witnessed the aftermath add another layer. Practical observers noting loot, captives, and immediate Ottoman efforts to secure control. The pattern of post-siege behavior is well known and reasonably consistent across source types. Janissaries and other troops looted, Istanbul's churches and palaces were stripped, and a large number of inhabitants were enslaved. Yet even in this chaotic shared picture, certain details stand out as odd in several independent records. One such cluster of oddities revolves around a young woman, Princess Theodora. Who was she? Our sources are conflicted and incomplete. Byzantine genealogical notices and refugee chronicles indicate she was a member of the Palaiologos line, still unmarried and likely in her teens or early 20s at the time of the fall. Some sources suggest she had been earmarked for a life connected to the imperial household, or perhaps the church. Her youth and status made her an asset and a symbol. For a conquering ruler like Mehmed II, whose legitimacy would be contested in the months and years after 1453, such women were not merely private individuals. They were pieces on the chessboard of dynastic politics. What follows is the part of the record that demands careful parsing. Multiple independent accounts, Ottoman court histories, Byzantine refugee memoirs, and letters from Venetian and Genoese merchants agree on three anomalous facts. First, Theodora was not lost in the general chaos of looting and enslavement. She was located by the Janissaries during the palace searches. Second, rather than being immediately placed with other captives or publicly paraded, she was brought to the Sultan and given a private audience. Third, after that audience, she was not returned to the standard quarters for captive women. Instead, she was sent to special quarters under direct palace supervision. Each of those facts is, on its own, ambiguous. Together, they create a pattern that official narratives could not, leave unexplained. We must emphasize source types. Ottoman chronicles written in the Sultan's orbit portray the meeting as a formal audience in which Mehmed behaved courteously. These chronicles tend to present the Ottoman ruler as magnanimous, often framing his encounters with captive nobility as acts of clemency intended to incorporate elites into the new order. Byzantine refugee accounts, however, tell a different story. Composed by people who fled the city and watched events from afar, these narratives are colored by trauma and suspicion. They report that the Sultan pressed Theodora with proposals. Some mention political marriage, others suggest attempts to induce public submission, and that she resisted on grounds of faith and familial honor. Merchant letters from Venice and Genoa, written by traders who were anxious to understand the political landscape and protect their interests, note the unusually long duration of the meeting and the Sultan's continued interest in the young princess after the main looting had ceased. The differences in tone are predictable given each observer's position. Ottoman annalists sought to legitimize a conquest and to present the Sultan as a wise, just ruler. Byzantine refugees, having lost everything, preserved a narrative of victimization and sacrilege. Italian merchants recorded practical, transactional details, but were susceptible to rumor. Our task is to sit at the conjunction of these partials and see what emerges without letting any single narrative dominate. What comes next is crucial: how we reconstruct the private audience itself. The record gives us three main possibilities, each of which fits with certain sources and contradicts others. One reconstruction follows the official Ottoman line. By this account, supported primarily by pro-Ottoman chroniclers, the Sultan's meeting with Theodora was an act of political accommodation. Mehmed, conscious of the need to stabilize a newly conquered metropolis and to secure the allegiance of former Byzantine elites, offered a dignified status to certain nobles, perhaps including marriage or honorable custody. In an empire that prized realpolitik, such a move could turn a symbol of resistance into a symbol of continuity. This reading leans on Ottoman texts that emphasize conciliation and reward. A second reconstruction aligns more with refugee narratives. It suggests Mehmed pursued marriage or co-optation as a matter not only of governance, but of personal preference and prestige. Here, the Sultan's prolonged interest becomes pressure, whether diplomatic, psychological, or coercive. These accounts imply that Theodora was asked, and strongly urged, to consent to a union or formal submission. According to this perspective, her refusal was framed as piety or loyalty to her imperial house. Byzantine sources, understandably hostile to Ottoman rule, present such resistance as moral triumph. They also add moral outrage to the political critique. A third reconstruction, suggested by certain Venetian and Genoese letters, reads the encounter as a slow campaign of persuasion. Not an immediate forced marriage, but a drawn-out attempt to win the young woman's acquiescence, through displays of power, offers of safety, or private threats. These letters emphasize process over spectacle, a meeting that lasted, conversations that continued, and Theodora being placed in special quarters where she remained under close guard. Each reconstruction has its own evidentiary supporters and detractors. None resolves the deeper mystery. Why, if the aim was political optics, would the Sultan place Theodora somewhere she could not be paraded as trophy or a formal bride? Why would a ruler who needed legitimate claims to Constantinople opt for secrecy or sequestration? The answers involve politics, power, and the unpredictable outcomes when private and public interests collide. We must also understand Mehmed II himself. Contemporary Ottoman sources and modern historians paint him as a multifaceted figure, a strategist with intellectual interests, a ruler eager to build a dynasty and a state apparatus that would outlast him, and a man for whom image and legitimacy mattered deeply. He was willing to cultivate Byzantine administrative talent, to respect scholars, and to invest in cultural projects that linked his regime to a wider Mediterranean legacy. At the same time, he was a conqueror who presided over violence and made hard choices in moments of crisis. His private motives, how much he acted from political calculation, personal desire, or ruthless expediency, are less easily parsed from the records available. The story complicates further when we turn to material evidence that only emerged centuries later. In the 20th century, scholars cataloguing Ottoman and related archives uncovered a small, damaged fragment of a court physician's diary. The fragment is neither long nor coherent. It is a palimpsest of lacunae and stains. Yet its presence in the archive raises the stakes of our inquiry. According to the scholarly edition and subsequent analyses, the fragment contains entries that reference a captive noblewoman's melancholia, signs of physical trauma, and, in a few heavily damaged lines, a term that later editors interpreted as indicating pregnancy. This is where the record becomes both compelling and treacherous. A single damaged medical note, if read in isolation, can be misinterpreted. But when read against the cluster of inconsistent contemporary accounts, private audience, special quarters, prolonged interest, the fragment invites a new reconstruction, one that treats Theodora not simply as a political prize, but as a vulnerable human caught in a web of power, possibly exposed to sexual violence with consequential medical outcomes. Before we proceed further into the medical fragment and the sensitive implications it raises, a brief content warning is necessary. The sources we will discuss include references to sexual violence and pregnancy connected to the fall of Constantinople. I will use measured clinical language. If these topics are distressing, you may wish to pause here. With that warning given, we can return to the fragment itself. Scholars who have examined it emphasize several methodological caveats. First, the diary entry is fragmentary and damaged. Entire words are missing, and the manuscript's provenance is complex. The text first surfaced in an Ottoman archive catalogue in the early 20th century. It was later transcribed by a court physician specialist whose hand and decisions shaped subsequent interpretations. Second, the language of medical observation in the 15th century differs from modern clinical language. Terms that might now read as clear indicators, notes on melancholia, wounds, or condition of uterus in a translation, could have alternative meanings in their original medical lexicon or simply be shorthand for observations whose context is lost. Third, editors and historians inevitably bring their biases to the transcription. A 20th century editor concerned with exposing unrecorded violence might emphasize certain lines. A later scholar, skeptical of sensational claims, might caution against tensing these lines into proof. Nonetheless, the fragment is not silent. It contains, in translation and paraphrase, observations that 3 successive editors considered significant. Repeated melancholic behavior of a female captive, traces of bruising or restraint in non-specific terms, and a description, partial and contested, interpreted by some as indicating pregnancy. Where the fragment specifies dates or treatments, those passages are either missing or illegible. The fragment ends abruptly, leaving readers with the sense of an interrupted record. How should historians handle such a text? The cautious approach is to treat the fragment as a piece of evidence that must be weighed alongside the other kinds of testimony. It does not, by itself, prove any specific outcome. It does, however, change the balance of probability in certain directions when combined with other records. If multiple independent witnesses suggest that Theodora was singled out and kept in special custody, and if the physician's fragment refers to symptoms consistent with trauma and possibly pregnancy, then the notion of an encounter that involves sexual violence becomes plausible enough to warrant serious investigation. At the same time, plausibility is not proof. We must repeatedly reiterate the nature of the evidence. Ottoman official narratives had reasons to avoid mentioning scandal. Byzantine refugee accounts, though passionate, often amplified the suffering of their community. Merchant letters might have been transmitted by intermediaries who favored gossip, and a single medical fragment, damaged and ambiguous, is legally and historically an incomplete record. This leads us to consider motives beyond immediate violence. If an assault did occur and a pregnancy resulted, why would the Sultan or his administration have chosen secrecy or removal rather than public measures? The answer emerges from the politics of legitimacy. Mehmed's conquest gave him a military victory, but legitimacy in the medieval Mediterranean relied on more than the sword. A sultan who could claim, genuinely or rhetorically, a degree of moral legitimacy, or who could incorporate Byzantine symbols and elites into his reign, would find his rule more stable. A public scandal involving sexual violence against a noble captive could delegitimize the regime's claim to honor and rightful rule, especially when the conquered polity included Christians, with external allies watching closely. A child born to a Christian noblewoman and fathered, whether consensually or not, by the Sultan or a member of his court, would complicate succession narratives, create questions about inheritance and dynastic identity, and potentially provide a rallying point for resistance. The need to manage such complications is visible in other historical moments. Rulers who encounter unwanted domestic scandals often conceal, displace, or neutralize them through marriage alliances, exile, removal, or worse. In Mehmed's case, the options included several pathways, some more palatable to the rulers and their chroniclers than others. He could have tried to cover the matter by secrecy, keeping Theodora out of public view and quietly arranging for her removal to another residence far from Constantinople. He could have tried to reframe the relationship in a way that served his public image, for example by formalizing an honorable custody or marriage that could be sold as reconciliation. He could, in darker scenarios posited by some scholars, have sanctioned the termination of the pregnancy, an action that could range from a medically assisted abortion to the removal or killing of an infant, each option with consequential ethical questions and requiring a level of secrecy and coordination. Or Theodora might have died in childbirth or from complications of trauma, an outcome that is both credible and, by virtue of its finality, complicates attempts to uncover the true sequence of events. All of these possibilities remain open in the record, and our evidence steers us towards some hypotheses more strongly than others. For example, contemporary silence on a public child or a marriage suggests that the administration found public incorporation politically unhelpful. The presence of Theodora in guarded special quarters suggests an intent to control information, either to protect her or to hide her. The physician's fragment, if interpreted to indicate pregnancy, provides a plausible causal link between private contact and a consequential medical fact. But equally plausible are explanations that do not involve violence, illness unrelated to assault, pregnancy resulting from consensual relations in the aftermath, or misreading of medical terminology. Here is where historiographical caution must be emphatic. We cannot, responsibly, translate plausibility into certainty. The constraints of our sources, their partiality, their silences, their editorial histories, demand that we bracket many claims with phrases like appears, suggests, is consistent with, or cannot be ruled out. We must also acknowledge that the actors involved, Mehmed and his advisors, palace physicians, palace security, had reasons to shape narratives, to erase traces, and to control memory. The process of forgetting can be as intentional as the process of commemoration. One useful lens for understanding the choices made in the aftermath is to consider the institutional stakes at play inside the Ottoman court. The Grand Vizier and senior advisors were not only implementers of policy, they also managed the Sultan's reputation and the court's relationship with foreign powers. Alil Pasha, named in some sources as a close counselor during the siege and its immediate aftermath, would have been acutely aware of the ramifications of any scandal involving a captured noblewoman. Ottoman officials, according to court records and later chroniclers, were adept at pragmatic solutions. Marriages of state, transfers of property, quiet exile, or simply erasing inconvenient details from official histories. The early months after May 1453 were a busy period for such managerial feats. Mehmed set about reorganizing the city, repopulating neighborhoods, and incorporating useful Byzantine administrators into his administration. At the same time, he received emissaries and scholars, and he oversaw the treatment, or punishment, of those perceived as collaborators or threats. It is in this atmosphere of intense political calculation that private matters like the condition of a captive noblewoman could be converted into matters of state. But we are still missing an essential piece. What happened to Theodora after her interdiction from the public eye? The physician's fragment hints at a medical trajectory. The chronicle cluster and merchant letters suggest she was sequestered. Beyond that, the documentary trail grows thin. The immediate Ottoman records that survive do not speak bluntly about any public trial, execution, or formal marriage. Byzantine refugee memories preserve the outrage, but not the paperwork. Merchant letters carry rumors, but not court minutes. At this point, one methodological approach is to map the types of outcomes and interrogate the relative evidentiary support for each. The main possibilities historians have debated include: 1. Theodora died, either in childbirth or due to complications from trauma or illness, shortly after the fall. 2. She was removed quietly from Constantinople to Anatolia or another provincial residence and lived out her life in seclusion. 3. A forced termination of pregnancy occurred, or the infant was separated or disposed of for political reasons. 4. She managed to escape or was spirited away by allies. 5. She was assimilated into the Ottoman household in a manner disguised by court narratives. Each scenario finds some resonance in certain source strands and faces difficulty in others. Death in childbirth would explain abrupt silence in later chronicles and the absence of a public child or heir. It is consistent with the high risks of childbirth and the fragmentary medical note. Removed to Anatolia would fit the pattern of special quarters and political exigency. Moving someone to the provinces keeps them out of the immediate public eye while preserving options. A concealed abortion or infant disposal is supported by the logic of dynastic risk. Rulers often sought to prevent the emergence of rival bloodlines, but the documentary evidence for such clandestine acts is thin and ethically fraught to assert without stronger proof. Escape is plausible, but given the level of guard and the Sultan's political interest, would have been difficult. Assimilation into the Ottoman household under a formal arrangement might have happened in more cases than we suppose, but it is inconsistent with the lack of public acknowledgement and with the refugee accounts that emphasize resistance. One more layer complicates the inquiry: the politics of memory and censorship. Winners write histories that legitimize their rule. Ottoman annalists crafted narratives emphasizing clemency, order, and administrative competence. When events did not fit the desired image, they were quietly elided. Conversely, the losing side, Byzantines in flight, wrote to preserve a moral record of suffering. Their accounts amplified injustice even where details were fuzzy. Merchants recorded the practical. The physician's fragment survived only because it was misfiled or ignored for centuries. Precisely those inconvenient documents are the ones most likely to upend official memories. At the moment the evidence draws tightest is the point where private medical observation and public omission intersect. The diary fragment records a condition that, if correctly interpreted, explains why the Sultan might have withheld public acknowledgement. If a pregnancy existed, and especially if it implicated the honor of a noble family, the Ottomans had reasons to suppress visible outcomes. The fragment's abrupt ending becomes a kind of historical silence with its own force. Yet the further we push from direct observation into inference, the more we must care for nuance. It is one thing to note that a medical fragment suggests pregnancy. It is quite another to assert definitively that the Sultan ordered the infant's removal or that Theodora was repeatedly assaulted. We can say, the cluster of independent, partial, and sometimes contradictory records makes it plausible that Theodora's encounter with the Sultan had consequences that the official history minimized or concealed. We can also say, the record contains no unambiguous, contemporaneous statement assigning responsibility or documenting the final outcome. So where does that leave us? We can outline the competing claims, weigh which pieces of evidence push probability in one direction, and recognize the gaps that prevent closure. We can also examine the broader consequences of each possibility for how we read the fall of Constantinople and the early Ottoman state. If the Sultan took steps to hide or neutralize a private scandal, that decision tells us about the priorities of early Ottoman rule. Stability and image management were vaulted above transparent justice. If instead, Theodora's fate was the result of random misfortune, a death from illness or complications, then the absence of record reflects the routines of a violent conquest in which many individuals vanished into anonymity. As we move deeper into the sources, two things become essential. First, any reconstruction must always indicate which source type supports a given claim. Ottoman Chronicle, Byzantine refugee account, Venetian or Genoese merchant letter, court physician's fragment, or later archival note. Second, we must call attention to the decisions archivists and editors made in transmitting that evidence. Lacunae, miscopying, translation choices, and cataloguing mistakes shape what later readers see. At the end of the first available set of documents, we are left with an image that is both specific and incomplete. We can picture the Janissaries bringing a young, pale-faced noblewoman into the Sultan's tent. We can imagine a private meeting that dragged on. We can read an italicized, smudged sentence in a physician's hand recording melancholia and a troubling physical condition. Yet beyond this image, the visceral smallness of a single person inside a vast political change, lies a corridor of silence. Records stop, voices fall away, and official histories move on as if nothing had happened. That silence is itself a historical artifact. It tells us about what authorities chose to remember and what they chose to forget. It forces us to confront the ethics of historical reconstruction. We must ask, do we honor the memory of Theodora by forcing a narrative where none can be confidently stated, or by refusing to speak at all? I would argue for neither extreme. The right path is one of careful interrogation, assembling what fragments we have, noting their limits, and letting the unresolved nature of the past remain visible rather than smoothed over. Theodora's name surfaces again, briefly, in scattered references over the next months and years, rumors mentioned in merchant dispatches, passing mentions in refugee letters accusing the Sultan of moral transgressions, a later chronicle's veiled comment that some matters were handled quietly. None of these items provides the moment-to-moment documentation we would need to decide the truth of the more grievous possibilities. What they do provide is a pattern, a cluster of hints, a medical fragment, and institutional silence. And so we reach a turning point in the investigation. The broken physician's entry, combined with the pattern of custody and omission, points toward a private tragedy that had public implications. It also raises a legal and moral question. How should modern historians treat evidence of sexual violence and pregnancy when sources are partial, potentially biased, and sometimes hostile? The answer adopted by most contemporary scholars is to be transparent about degrees of certainty, explicitly labeling what is demonstrable, what is probable, and what remains speculative. We must also respect the dignity of the person at the center of the story. Theodora is not a cipher for debate. She is an individual whose life intersected with empire-making and whose possible suffering calls for careful, morally attentive reconstruction rather than sensationalism. There is one last piece of evidence to consider before we pause our reconstruction. An index entry in an Ottoman administrative ledger, dated months after the fall, records a transfer of funds for the upkeep of a female captive relocated to a provincial palace. The entry is terse. No name, no origin. It is marginalia, an accounting footnote. Yet when read alongside the physician's fragment and the reports of special quarters, it creates a plausible administrative trail. Someone matching Theodora's description may have been moved out of the capital and provided for in a way that kept her existence from becoming public knowledge. This administrative trace does not settle the matter. It is a clue among many, a breadcrumb that hints at concealment rather than condemnation. It tells us that the Ottoman court had mechanisms to remove persons from public view without entirely erasing them from administrative records. It also exemplifies the difficulty of proving a narrative of violence when the records that would most directly document it were precisely the ones most likely to be suppressed or destroyed. At this point in the reconstruction, our narrative reaches an uncomfortable but necessary suspension. We have traced the fall of Constantinople and the capture of Princess Theodora. We have mapped the anomalous facts that draw her out of the general chaos. We have compared and weighed competing accounts of the private audience with Mehmed II. We have examined a damaged physician's fragment that introduces the possibility of pregnancy and trauma. And we have followed faint administrative traces, suggesting removal from the capital. The pattern is suggestive. It demands further inquiry, deeper archival digging, scrutiny of transmission histories, and careful weighing of biases and lacunae. But even at this stage, the story already tells us something larger. It reveals how the mechanics of conquest intersect with the intimate vulnerabilities of individuals. It shows how winners and their chroniclers manage memory. It also demonstrates why certain histories are erased or left to survive only as fragments. Theodora's life, partial in our records, becomes a test case for the ethical work of historians, to assemble, to withhold, and to honor. Before we close this segment of the investigation, I will make one more methodological point that will guide the next stage of our work. Where the evidence is ambiguous but consequential, such as the physician's fragment that hints at pregnancy, we should adopt a probabilistic narrative. That means ranking hypotheses by the weight of converging evidence, rather than treating any single account as decisive. It means being explicit about which combination of sources supports which theory. And it means keeping the human dignity of the subject central, refusing to reduce Theodora to a mere vector of violence. Finally, if Theodora's story matters to you, please share this video with one person who cares about historical truth and marginal voices. Comment with one word, Theodora, to help these lost names stay alive in public memory. There are more archives to consult, more marginal notes to analyze, and more interpretive steps to take before we can responsibly say which of the available scenarios is most likely. The next set of documents includes a fuller transcription attempt of the court physician's notes, the marginal annotations of a Venetian consul's letter that references a woman kept apart by the Sultan, and a set of Ottoman administrative entries that may clarify the provincial transfer. These fragments promise either to clarify the sequence or to deepen the silence. For now, we must sit with the facts we have. A conquest that reshaped worlds, a palace that sheltered secrets, a young noblewoman whose capture placed her at the intersection of private vulnerability and statecraft, and an archival fragment that hints at a tragedy carefully obscured by the requirements of political legitimacy. Theodora's name endures in these remnants, not because we can reconstruct her life in full, but because the traces she left force us to confront how power rewrites lives and memories, and how, even centuries later, diligent attention to small, damaged texts can reopen suppressed histories. What follows are the documents the first sweep promised: the marginalia, the fuller medical transcription, the ledger entries, and the careful weighing of what they together make plausible, probable, or still wholly uncertain. A few months after the fall, a Venetian consul copied a hurried letter into his dispatch book. In the margin of that copy, in a different hand, someone, probably the consul himself on rereading, added a note. A woman kept apart by the Sultan, watched over by his household. The entry is not a proclamation. It reads as a whisper. The main body of the letter concerns trade agreements and the safety of Venetian merchants. The marginal line is almost an aside. Yet its existence matters. It is a non-Ottoman, near-contemporaneous observation, written by an outsider whose professional need was to report political facts back to Venice. This is not a refugee chronicle motivated by grief. It is not a partisan panegyric. It is a trader's marginal curiosity turned record, Venetian consul letter, late 1453. We then have a second document that has done more to shift scholarly attention than any rumor. A more complete edition of the court physician's notes, prepared decades after the fragment first surfaced and published as a tentative reconstruction in the 1920s. Here, the editorial history is important to stress. The manuscript itself was damaged, wormholes, ink blots, and erased lines. Editors in different periods supplied restorations in divergent ways. The 1920s edition attempted to fill gaps with plausible Latinized medical terms. A later mid-century scholar pushed back on those readings, and a third editor in the 1990s applied multispectral imaging to a microfilm of the folio, recovering brief strokes that earlier eyes had read as marks, but could now be tentatively converted into letters. What the better editions converge on, though still with heavy caveats, is a short passage that, in paraphrase, notes a young captive exhibiting protracted melancholy, a pattern of bruising consistent with restraint, and, most provocatively, a line translated variously as condition of the womb noted, or evidence of an intrauterine state. Editors differ on how to render the final phrase. Some favor the neutral condition, others the more explicit pregnancy. None claim to be certain. Most scholars who have worked on these passages emphasize the following. The note is medical shorthand. The physician may have been recording symptoms, not a definitive diagnosis, and the fragmentary state of the folio leaves open the possibility of alternate readings. Court physician's fragment, multiple editorial editions, 20th century codicological work. If we bracket the precise translation, the fragment still changes our evidentiary calculus. Where before we had only behavioral reports, Theodora kept apart, a long private audience, special quarters, a medical observation of a reproductive condition provides a mechanism by which public silence becomes explicable. A political ruler can more easily tolerate an enemy noble's continued presence as a controlled hostage than he can tolerate an unresolved, visible offspring intimately connected to both the conquered dynasty and the conqueror's household. The medical note, even read cautiously, suggests that the question to be answered was not only, what did Mehmed want, but also, what would happen when the private consequence of that desire produced a biological fact no propaganda could easily erase? Next to those two documents sits another cluster of archival traces, the Ottoman administrative marginalia. These are not proclamations, but dry bookkeeping. Allocations for the maintenance of persons recorded as female captive or a woman transmitted to provincial upkeep. One such entry, short, bureaucratic, dated within months of the conquest, records transfer and upkeep funds for a woman moved to a non-capital residence described as a palace estate in Anatolia. The entry names no individual, but it notes guard allowances and periodic food provisions, implying continued supervision and provisioning by the central administration. Ottoman Provincial Ledger, late 1453. Taken together, the consul's marginal note, the physician's fragment, the provincial transfer, an administrative logic appears. The Ottoman court possessed means to remove sensitive people from the capital's public stage while continuing to exercise control over their physical welfare. That pattern fits the hypothesis that Theodora, if indeed she was the captive referenced, was sequestered, preserved from public display, yet kept under supervision where the court could manage rumor and risk. Let us now move from documents to inference, sticking always to the limits that the sources impose. First hypothesis: death in childbirth or due to complications soon after capture. This is consistent with both the physician's note, a reproductive condition plus medical observation, and the sudden silences in later narrative records. Childbirth in the 15th century was hazardous. If Theodora had become pregnant and then died, whether from labor, infection, or other complications, her disappearance would explain why no child emerged into public memory and why subsequent Ottoman chronicles do not record a marriage or incorporation. The relative evidentiary weight here? Moderate. It rests on the plausibility of childbirth mortality and the fragmentary medical note, and is buttressed by the administrative silence. It is, however, less directly supported by explicit documentation of a death. Second hypothesis: sequestering in the provinces, quiet removal and lifelong seclusion. The administrative ledger entries give this idea the most direct documentary support. A woman transferred to a provincial estate with funds for upkeep suggests a deliberate choice to remove someone from the capital. If the aim was to protect, hide, or disempower without resorting to more drastic measures, provincial sequester is an efficient state solution. This outcome aligns neatly with what we know of early Ottoman administrative pragmatism: remove a potential scandal from the center, maintain supervision, and avoid public scrutiny. Evidentiary weight, fairly strong in administrative terms, though it does not explain the medical observation alone, only how the court might respond to such a condition. Third hypothesis: forced or coerced termination of pregnancy, or infant disposal. The logic here is political. A ruler facing the prospect of an offspring with a problematic dynastic identity might choose to prevent that child from ever becoming a public actor. This is not an unprecedented impulse in medieval politics, although documentary evidence for such clandestine actions is typically scarce, because secrecy is their point. The physician's fragment, if read to indicate a pregnancy, gives motive. The administrative traces of removal give capacity. But the direct documentary evidence for a forced termination or the killing of an infant is absent. What we have are inferences rather than witness reports. Scholars who consider this hypothesis rank it as plausible but poorly documented. An inference drawn from motive and capability more than from proof. Evidentiary weight, low to moderate. Fourth hypothesis: consensual or coerced assimilation into the Ottoman household with later concealment. In some conquered households, noble captives were integrated into the conqueror's household, or even absorbed through marriage alliances that served political purposes. This hypothesis would require public steps, marriage records, mentions of offspring, or some subsequent role for the woman in Ottoman court life. The absence of these public traces in the sources we have scanned makes this outcome less likely for Theodora. Evidentiary weight, low. Fifth hypothesis: escape or rescue. The refugee accounts, full of rumor and outrage, sometimes assert that allies tried to spirit persons of importance to safety. Escape is not impossible. The mercantile networks and religious houses that survived in and around Constantinople could conceivably have assisted someone. But the concept collides with the administrative ledger's sign of central surveillance and with the merchant letter's impression that Theodora remained under guard. If an escape occurred, we would expect some corroborating trail, letters, sanctuary records, or a later chronicle tracing a blessed exile. In the absence of such threads, escape is the least likely hypothesis on the current evidence. Evidentiary weight, low. Ranking these, based purely on the converging archival material and on historical plausibility, gives us a working scale. Sequestration to the provinces and death in childbirth are the most plausible outcomes. Forced termination or infant disposal remains possible but weakly attested. Formal assimilation and escape are less likely. But these rankings must be read with a caveat. Different scholars privilege different types of evidence. A historian who emphasizes administrative traces will favor sequestration as the primary outcome. A medical historian who reads the physician's fragment confidently toward pregnancy may see death in childbirth as more probable. We must therefore treat the ranking as a map of probability, not a map of certainty. Beyond the raw question of outcome, the story reveals a second, deeper dynamic: the ways institutions prioritize legitimacy over disclosure. If we accept that Ottoman officials made a strategic choice to remove Theodora from public view, that choice was not merely personal or petty. It reflected a calculation, about how newly established regimes manage fragile political capital. Mehmed had just conquered an empire with an ancient capital. His symbolic position depended on more than force. It required the acquiescence, or at least the manageable reaction, of Christian populations, neighboring courts, and potential rivals within his own apparatus. A public scandal implicating an imperial house's female member would feed enemy propaganda, sharpen factional lines, and potentially make the consolidation project harder. Several patterns of Ottoman governance in the post-1453 years corroborate this reasoning. Mehmed sought to repopulate the city carefully, to place trusted administrators in key roles, and to cultivate an image, at least in certain chronicles, of a ruler who was civilized, magnanimous, and able to govern a multi-confessional capital. Removing a sensitive human problem into the provinces solves a short political problem. Rumor contained, rivals placated, domestic stability preserved. That same logic explains why expense ledgers rather than public proclamations are what survives on this question. Administration does not court the historian's eye. It gets on with practicalities. There is, however, another interpretive lens worth applying: the politics of silence. Historians of memory have long emphasized that silence is itself a rhetorical and political act. When official narratives omit an event, when state annals suppress a scandal, the disappearance is intentional or consequential, whatever the motivation. In Theodora's case, the silence that shadows her name tells us as much about the priorities of power as any explicit chronicle might. The problem for historians is to probe the silences without converting them into conspiratorial certainties. We must be disciplined in turning absence into inference. This methodological discipline leads to practical recommendations for further scholarship. Theodora's case would benefit from three kinds of work. First, codicological re-examination of the physician's folio using non-invasive imaging could yet recover letter traces. Advances in multispectral imaging and in the analysis of iron gall ink residues have resolved disputed readings in other medieval manuscripts. A careful re-examination of the folio might push ambiguous readings in one direction or another. Second, a systematic combing of provincial fiscal registers for a few years after 1453 could reveal more than one terse transfer entry, patterns of provisioning, repeated disbursements, or notes about household personnel that would strengthen the sequester hypothesis. Third, comparative study of similar post-conquest cases where rulers faced reproductive or reputational complications involving captive noblewomen could supply analogues that sharpen our understanding of likely administrative responses. We must also consider how later centuries treated Theodora's story. National narratives, Ottoman, Greek, and European, each had different incentives. For Greek nationalist memory, Theodora could become a symbol of lost victimhood. For some Ottoman chronicles, the story could be awkward or smoothed away. For Western merchants, the anecdote was a political footnote. These later appropriations and elisions complicate the historian's task. They remind us that the archival trace is not only what survives by accident, but also what is curated by later readers and editors. The physician's note might have lingered only because it was misfiled, and the ledger entries endure because fiscal bookkeeping is tedious but durable. The survival of evidence is never neutral. One ethical question also warrants explicit attention: how to write about sexual violence and reproduction when sources are fragmentary. We cannot conflate plausibility with moral certainty, yet we cannot ignore the plausibility either. The decision to raise the possibility of assault or forced pregnancy in a public forum is not taken lightly. It must be done with a clear explanation of why the hypothesis is being considered, careful attribution to source types at every step, and an insistence on the dignity of the person at the narrative core. Our reconstruction must never reduce Theodora to a symbol. It must preserve her as an individual whose life, partial in the documents, deserves compassion. What then is the historiographical verdict we can responsibly state at this point, given all the documents surveyed? 1. It is highly probable that Theodora was recognized as an individual of political significance after the fall of Constantinople. This is supported by independent contemporary notices, Janissary reports, merchant letters, and refugee memoirs that align on the fact she was singled out and brought to the Sultan, Ottoman chronicles, Byzantine refugee accounts, Venetian and Genoese letters. 2. It is strongly plausible that she was given special custody under palace supervision and subsequently removed from public view. This inference rests on administrative ledger entries and on the pattern observed in multiple source types of special quarters and later marginal notes, Ottoman provincial ledger, Venetian marginalia. 3. It is plausible but not proven that a reproductive event occurred. The physician's fragment provides circumstantial, ambiguous evidence. If such an event happened, it offers a clear motive for the court to avoid public disclosure. The level of proof is not sufficient to assert a specific outcome beyond reasonable doubt. Court physician's fragment, ambiguous. 4. Any claim that she was repeatedly sexually assaulted, that she bore a child who was killed or hidden, or that Mehmed personally ordered a termination of pregnancy must be presented as hypotheses supported by circumstantial logic and motive, not as fact. The documentary evidence for such actions is thin and inferential, susceptible to different readings: Byzantine refugee outrage, political motive, lack of direct proof. In short, the weight of evidence supports a narrative of recognition, special custody, and subsequent removal from public view. It does not allow us to state, with confidence, the precise bodily outcomes or the intimate details of what transpired in private. Beyond the historical particulars, there is a moral and civic implication to linger upon. The reconstruction of Theodora's possible fate is not merely an exercise in resolving a curiosity from the 15th century. It is a test of how modern publics confront the silences left by powerful institutions, how we use fragmentary traces to resist erasure, how we weigh probabilities without converting speculation into dogma, and how we honor lives whose endings are not recorded in full. So where should a listener leave this inquiry? Not with an answer, but with a set of reasoned probabilities and a sense of why the question mattered then and matters now. The most likely scenario, given current evidence, is administrative. Theodora was singled out after the fall, given private custody under palace supervision, and at some point removed from the capital, provided for, controlled, and kept out of the public narratives that would shape Mehmed's early reign. Whether that removal resulted from illness, childbirth, sheltering, or a more tragic intervention is not decisively recorded. That lack of decisive record is itself a historical fact about power. Certain consequences can be muted by those who hold the keys to narrative authority. Our responsibility as historians and as citizens of memory is thus twofold. First, to keep searching archives with methodological rigor and technical care, to let the material speak where it can. And second, to hold the question in a posture of respectful uncertainty, acknowledging suffering when it is supported by plausible evidence, but stopping short of verdict in the absence of proof. This stance honors both the impulse to recover silenced lives and the caution necessary in working with fragmentary sources. Finally, after all this reconstruction and cautious ranking, we must restore the human center. Theodora's name signifies a person who, whatever the final outcome, found herself at the intersection of empires. She was a young noble whose life was reshaped by the collapse of a polity and the exigencies of a new one. Our act of remembrance is not to score a historical point for one side or another, but to acknowledge the human cost that too often recedes behind triumphalist histories. If this inquiry moved you, if you believe lost names deserve careful recovery, please consider sharing this episode and leaving a single word in the comments: Theodora. so that these fragile stories remain in our communal memory. For those who want to read further, check the description for the editions cited here. The editions of the Physician's Fragment, the Venetian Dispatches, and the Ottoman Fiscal Registers. Her name returns us to the ethical core of history, to remember that behind every grand political turn there are persons whose stories ask to be told with care. Theodora, remember her name.